A chance encounter. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the brick facade of St. Mary's Orphanage, its warm golden rays illuminating the worn but welcoming structure. The peaceful setting had become a familiar retreat for Daniel Johnson, a police officer whose visits to the orphanage had slowly begun to heal a heart that had been broken too many times. Today, as his patrol car pulled into the parking lot, Daniel allowed himself a brief moment of stillness. He switched off the engine, his eyes lingering on the building, as if it held the answers to some unspoken question. For Daniel, the orphanage was more than just a place to visit. It was his sanctuary. When the world outside seemed full of noise, chaos, and the relentless weight of his job, the orphanage brought him a kind of peace. It was as though, in the laughter and innocence of the children, he could rediscover a part of himself that had long been lost, a part of himself that had once believed in hope, in second chances, and in family. And though the warmth of the children had been a balm for his soul, it was one child in particular, a little girl named Maya, who had begun to crack open his heart in ways he hadn't expected. Sitting for a moment in the silence of his car, Daniel took a deep breath and let it out slowly. The memories of his own daughter, a bright-eyed girl with a smile that could light up a room, flooded his thoughts. He hadn't meant to linger in the past, but it was impossible not to when the emptiness of his home echoed with the absence of her presence. He hadn't seen her in years, not since the accident that took his family from him, leaving him to carry the unbearable weight of grief and regret. When he stepped out of the car and made his way to the entrance, the soft chime of the doorbell greeted him. Sister Margaret, the warm-hearted matron of the orphanage, was waiting for him as always, her welcoming smile a comfort in itself. "Officer Johnson. I mean Daniel," she corrected herself with a gentle laugh. "The children have been asking about you all day. They can't wait for your visit." Daniel smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It's just me, sister. No need for the formalities. I'm happy to be here." Sister Margaret chuckled softly. "Well, Daniel, you're a sight for sore eyes around here. We're always glad for your company." As they entered the orphanage together, the sound of children's laughter filled the hallways, a cacophony of joy that seemed to lighten the very air. Daniel paused for a moment, letting the sound of their laughter wash over him. It was a sound that, somehow, made him feel less alone. They made their way to the playroom, where the children were busy at various activities. Some were gathered around a table, carefully building structures with colorful blocks, while others sat at smaller tables, coloring with crayons. The sight of so many smiling faces, each one so full of life and possibility, gave Daniel a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. "Can I get some help here?" Daniel called out, holding up a softball. The younger children, eager for his attention, abandoned their games in an instant. They rushed toward him, their tiny hands reaching up to him in excitement. Daniel chuckled as he knelt down, tossing the ball to one child, then another. His heart lightened with each laugh that followed, each joyful cry of catch. Among the children, Daniel noticed a familiar face, Maya. She was sitting at the far end of the room, her dark eyes scanning the scene. Unlike the other children, who were running around or engaging in play, Maya sat quietly, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing patterns on the worn wooden table in front of her. Though she had come a long way since first arriving at the orphanage, Daniel could still sense the hesitation in her movements, the uncertainty in the way she interacted with the others. Maya had been through so much in her short life: loss, abandonment, and an unrelenting sense of loneliness. Despite her reserved nature, Maya's eyes often lingered on Daniel when he visited, and he couldn't help but feel a connection to her, one that seemed deeper than he could explain. There was something about her, a quiet strength that resonated with him in ways he hadn't anticipated. It was as if, without even trying, she could see through his facade and into the part of him that longed to be whole again. "Hey, Maya," Daniel called softly, walking over to where she sat. She looked up at him, her lips curving into a shy smile. "Hi, Officer Johnson," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hey, I told you before, it's just Daniel," he said with a warm smile, sitting down beside her. "You're not in trouble, I promise." Maya's smile widened slightly, though it was still laced with uncertainty. "Okay, Daniel." Daniel could feel her reluctance to engage, her hesitation as though she wasn't entirely sure if she was allowed to be part of the world around her. He understood that feeling. It was the same feeling he carried with him every day, a sense of not quite belonging, of being on the outside looking in. "What are you working on?" he asked gently, gesturing to the table in front of her. Maya glanced down at the scattered drawings in front of her fingers still tracing the edges of a small paper. "Just some pictures," she said quietly, picking up one of her drawings. "I like to draw. It helps me think." Daniel leaned closer, his eyes taking in the picture she had created, a small, lonely figure standing beneath a wide, open sky. The figure was small, almost dwarfed by the vastness of the landscape, but there was a quiet sense of hope in the way the sky seemed to stretch on forever. "It's beautiful," Daniel said, his voice soft. Maya glanced up at him, surprised by his genuine praise. "Really?" "Really," he affirmed, smiling at her. "You've got a lot of talent." For a moment, their eyes locked, and in that quiet exchange, Maya seemed to relax. Her shoulders, which had been hunched in a way that seemed to carry the weight of all her fears, slowly eased. It was as though Daniel's simple words of kindness, of understanding, had begun to peel back the layers of doubt she had built around herself. She wasn't used to this. People seeing her, truly seeing her, and not turning away. She wasn't used to someone taking the time to ask her questions, to genuinely care about what she had to say. And it was in that small moment, that fleeting connection between the two of them, that something began to shift within her. "Do you want to play catch?" Daniel asked, standing up and offering his hand. Maya hesitated for a moment, her eyes searching his face for any hint of insincerity. But when she saw none, when she saw only warmth and kindness, she nodded shyly. "Okay," she said, standing up and reaching for the ball he held out to her. As they walked outside to join the other children, Maya's heart fluttered with a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time, a sense of belonging. She was a part of this, a part of something that was bigger than just the orphanage. And maybe, just maybe, she could find a place for herself in the world that didn't involve running from the past. Daniel, too, felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known in years. As they played catch, as he watched Maya's face light up with each throw and catch, he couldn't help but feel that this moment, this connection, was what he had been missing all along. He had come to the orphanage to help, to offer guidance and support. But what he had found, in Maya's shy smile and hesitant laughter, was a chance to heal. And though he didn't know it yet, this chance encounter would become the beginning of something far more profound than either of them could have imagined. A father's promise. The days that followed Daniel's promise to Maya were filled with uncertainty and a mix of emotions. At first, it felt as though they were both tiptoeing around the new dynamic that had been formed between them. Maya, though small and often reserved, began to seek out Daniel more often, her eyes following him like a shadow whenever he was around. Her trust in him had blossomed in that single moment, but Daniel knew that trust, as fragile as it was, would take time to solidify. And he wasn't sure if he was capable of giving her the kind of stability she so desperately needed. The first few weeks were the hardest. Daniel would come to the orphanage after his shifts, his patrol car a familiar presence in the parking lot. Each time he walked through the gates, he couldn't help but wonder what he could offer Maya that no one else could. Was he truly enough to fill the role of a father for her? Could he erase the years of abandonment and longing from her heart? Maya's presence was a constant reminder of the child he had lost. Every time he looked into her eyes, he saw a reflection of his own daughter. Her innocence, her vulnerability, the endless possibility of the future. But that future had been stolen from him. His own daughter's laughter was now a memory he could barely hold on to. She was gone, taken in a way that felt like a cruel twist of fate. How could he possibly live up to being the father Maya needed when he couldn't even protect his own flesh and blood? But when he looked at her, really looked, he saw more than just a child in need. He saw a little girl with dreams, with hopes, with the capacity to heal, just like him. The difference was that she didn't carry the same burden of guilt and regret that haunted him. Maya hadn't built walls around her heart. She had simply lost her way and was looking for someone to show her the path back to hope. It was that thought that kept him coming back to the orphanage every day. He had promised her something he wasn't sure he could deliver, but the desire to try was stronger than the fear of failure. Maybe he couldn't be the perfect father, but he could give her something real. He could show her that she wasn't alone, that there was a future filled with possibilities, even if it was a future they would have to build together. One afternoon, after a long shift, Daniel pulled into the parking lot and saw Maya sitting on the steps of the orphanage, her legs tucked underneath her. She looked small against the large worn door, her dark curls falling loosely around her face. There was an air of contemplation about her, as if she were waiting for something, someone. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap. Daniel hesitated for a moment before getting out of the car. He hadn't seen her this quiet in a while, and a part of him worried that she was carrying a weight he couldn't yet understand. He approached slowly, unsure of what to say or do. He wasn't the best with words, especially when it came to matters of the heart, but he knew he couldn't avoid this moment. "Maya," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned toward him, her face lighting up when she saw him. A small smile tugged at the corners of her lips, but there was something unreadable in her eyes, a shadow that Daniel hadn't seen before. She stood up as he reached her, and for a moment, she just stood there, not speaking, as if trying to gather her thoughts. "Hi, Officer Dan," she said, her voice almost too quiet, too careful. "Hey, Maya," Daniel replied, his tone gentle. "You okay?" She nodded, but it didn't feel convincing. "I'm fine. Just thinking." He crouched down to her level, trying to meet her gaze. "Thinking about what?" She hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about my mom, my dad." Daniel's heart sank at the mention of her parents. He had known, of course, that Maya had been abandoned, but hearing her speak about it so openly made the reality of her situation all the more painful. She had never really talked about her past before, never let herself linger on the memories of the parents who had left her behind. "I don't really remember them," Maya continued, her voice quieter now, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "I don't even know if they ever loved me. But I remember. I remember wanting them to, wishing they would come back. I wanted to ask them why they left me here. I wanted to know if I was bad, if I was the reason they didn't want me." Daniel's chest tightened at her words. He had always known that the children at the orphanage carried their own burdens, their own scars from being abandoned or orphaned, but hearing Maya speak so vulnerably about her pain was like a punch to the gut. "Maya," Daniel said, his voice shaking slightly as he reached out, placing his hand on her small shoulder. "You are not the reason they left you here. It's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong." She met his eyes then, her own filled with a mixture of hope and doubt. "But what if I'm not good enough for anyone? What if I'm never good enough to be loved?" The words, so raw and innocent, broke Daniel's heart. He wanted to tell her everything would be okay, that she would find a family, a place where she would be loved unconditionally. But the reality was far from that. The world was harsh, and he couldn't guarantee her happiness or safety in a way that felt certain. "Maya," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you are more than enough. You are kind and smart and strong. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. You're worthy of love, and I." He paused, unsure of how to put his feelings into words. He wasn't sure if he could find the right ones. But looking at her, he realized that he didn't need perfect words. He just needed to be there for her. "I will always be here for you," he said, his voice steady now, full of the quiet certainty that had been building inside him since the day he made that promise. I may not be your mom or dad, but I will care for you. I'll love you the way you deserve to be loved. I'll be the person you can count on, Maya. You don't have to face this world alone anymore." Tears welled in Maya's eyes as she looked up at him, her fragile walls breaking down in an instant. She didn't say anything, but the look on her face, the silent relief, the flicker of hope rekindled in her heart, spoke volumes. It was a look he would remember forever. Slowly, Maya stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him tightly. It wasn't the desperate, uncertain hug of a little girl reaching for anything familiar. It was a hug of trust, of acceptance. She believed in him now. And for Daniel, that simple gesture, that simple act of faith, was enough to reaffirm his promise to her. In that moment, he knew he wasn't just offering her a place in his life. He was offering her a future. Together, they could build something stronger than the painful past they both carried. And though the road ahead would be difficult, Daniel was ready to walk it with Maya, one step at a time. Shattered walls and new beginnings. The days that followed the conversation between Daniel and Maya marked the beginning of something neither of them could have anticipated. A slow, tentative healing process. In the weeks that passed, their bond deepened, but not without growing pains. Maya's trust in Daniel was not something that could be built in a single moment or even a few weeks. Her heart, though full of hope, carried the weight of years spent in an orphanage, wondering where she belonged and why she had been abandoned. But for every small moment of fear, for every hesitant glance, there was a quiet assurance in Daniel's heart. He wasn't perfect. He knew that. But for Maya, he would try every single day. Daniel's life outside of the orphanage had become increasingly difficult to navigate. The memories of his own lost child were never far from his mind. He still woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, haunted by the memory of his daughter's laugh, her voice, and the empty space beside him that would never again be filled. But there was something different about this time, this second chance. For the first time since his daughter had passed, Daniel felt a spark of something he thought he had lost: hope. It was a fragile thing, one that could be extinguished in an instant, but it was there. And Maya, with her endless questions and moments of pure joy, was the light that fed it. Maya, in turn, seemed to adjust to her new life with Daniel cautiously. Her laughter had become more frequent, her shy smiles had become more confident. But the scars of abandonment were not so easily erased. She still carried a quiet sadness with her, a flicker of doubt that danced behind her eyes whenever Daniel wasn't around. Was he really going to stay? Was he truly someone she could rely on, or would he disappear like so many others had? Daniel could see the struggle in her, but he also knew it was a necessary part of healing. The orphanage, with its laughter-filled halls and echoes of children playing, became a backdrop to the growing connection between the two. Sister Margaret, the matron of the orphanage, had watched the dynamic shift between the two with a knowing smile. She had seen children come and go, been witness to countless attempts to fill the void left by absent parents, but there was something different about this situation. She saw a father figure emerging in Daniel, someone who, despite his own grief, was willing to open his heart to a little girl who needed him. It was early one morning when Daniel got a call from Sister Margaret. He had just finished his breakfast and was getting ready for another day of patrolling the city when his phone rang. "Hello, Daniel," Sister Margaret greeted him. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "No, not at all. What's going on?" Daniel asked, sensing the urgency in her tone. "I need you to come by the orphanage as soon as you can," she said softly. "It's about Maya." His heart immediately skipped a beat. "What happened? Is she okay?" "She's fine physically, but she's been acting out," Sister Margaret explained, her voice tinged with concern. "She's withdrawn more than usual, and I think it has something to do with the anniversary of her parents' disappearance. We all know that date has been difficult for her in the past." Daniel didn't need to be told twice. He could hear the worry in Sister Margaret's voice, and he knew that Maya was struggling in ways he couldn't fully understand. "I'll be right there," he said, his mind racing. By the time Daniel arrived at the orphanage, the air felt heavy with tension. Sister Margaret met him at the door, her kind eyes shadowed with concern. "She's in her room," Sister Margaret said, leading him up the stairs. "She hasn't spoken to anyone since breakfast." Daniel nodded grimly and followed her down the hallway to Maya's room. As he approached, he could hear the faint sound of muffled sobs coming from within. His chest tightened, and a wave of helplessness washed over him. Sister Margaret gave him a sympathetic look before stepping back. "She needs you, Daniel. I know she's been through a lot, but I believe she trusts you more than anyone else right now." Taking a deep breath, Daniel gently knocked on the door before pushing it open. Inside, Maya was sitting on the edge of her bed, her knees pulled up to her chest. Her dark eyes were red from crying, and her face was buried in her hands. She didn't look up when he entered. "Maya." Daniel's voice was soft, cautious. "It's me, Officer Dan. Can I come in?" Maya sniffled and wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve, but didn't answer. Daniel stepped inside anyway, his heart aching for her. He sat down beside her on the bed, close enough to offer comfort, but not too close to invade her space. "I know it's hard," Daniel said, his voice low and soothing. "But you don't have to go through this alone. You can talk to me, Maya. You can tell me what's hurting you." She didn't respond at first, and the silence stretched between them. Then, after a long pause, Maya spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know why they didn't want me, why they left me. I keep asking myself, what's wrong with me? Why does no one want me?" Daniel's heart shattered at her words. The pain she carried was so raw, so unfiltered, that it tore at him. He reached out and placed his hand on hers, offering warmth and reassurance. "Maya," he said gently, his voice thick with emotion, "there is absolutely nothing wrong with you. You are not the reason they left. People make terrible decisions sometimes, and it's not your fault. You didn't deserve any of this. You are an amazing girl, and I'm so lucky that I get to know you." She looked up at him then, her eyes filled with a mix of disbelief and hope. "But what if you leave me too? What if I'm not enough?" Daniel's throat tightened, and he struggled to hold back his own tears. He had heard this kind of fear before, in the voice of his daughter, in the faces of so many children he had seen over the years. It was a fear of abandonment, of not being enough, of being forgotten. "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly. "I'm not going to leave you, Maya. I know it's scary, but I promise you, I'm here to stay. I'll be your family. You don't have to be afraid anymore." For a long moment, Maya studied him, her eyes searching his face for any hint of insincerity. But all she found was the quiet truth of his words. Slowly, tentatively, she let go of her fears and allowed herself to believe him. She threw herself into his arms, her small body trembling with emotion. "I'm scared, Dan. I'm so scared." "I know," Daniel whispered, holding her close, his heart breaking all over again. "But we're going to face it together, okay? I'm right here, Maya. You're not alone anymore." The words, simple as they were, seemed to dissolve the last of her doubts. Maya clung to him tightly, her sobs muffled in his chest. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Daniel allowed himself to cry too. Not just for Maya, but for everything he had lost and everything he had found again in her. They sat there together, the weight of the world momentarily lifting, as father and daughter shared a moment of understanding, of healing. The bond they had begun to build was fragile, but it was real. And no matter how long it took, no matter the challenges they would face, Daniel knew that he would do whatever it took to protect her, to be the father she had longed for, and to help her heal from the scars of her past. In that quiet, tender moment, surrounded by nothing but the echo of Maya's whispered promises and his own unspoken vow to never leave her, Daniel knew that they had already begun to build a new life. Together. The long road to healing. The days that followed that tear-filled afternoon marked a significant turning point in Daniel and Maya's relationship. Slowly but surely, The walls that Maya had spent so many years building around her heart began to crumble. She allowed herself to trust him more with each passing day, and he, despite the lingering scars of his own past, was determined to be the steady presence she so desperately needed. Maya's recovery wasn't linear. There were moments when her past would surface in unexpected ways, moments when the weight of everything she had been through seemed unbearable. But Daniel, ever patient, was there for her through every small victory and every setback. And as he watched her slowly regain her ability to smile without reservation, he began to believe, more and more, that they were both healing together. Maya was no longer just the little girl who had asked him to be her dad in a moment of vulnerability. She was becoming a part of him, a part of his life, in a way he had never anticipated. The change in Maya was gradual, yet undeniable. Her laughter, which had once been hesitant and uncertain, was now becoming more frequent, more genuine. She was playing with the other children at the orphanage more often, her face lighting up when she engaged in activities with the other kids. She started to take an interest in the little things, like drawing pictures of sunsets and animals. Things that once seemed trivial, but now served as windows into her healing spirit. But despite the progress, there were still moments when Maya would retreat into herself. Daniel could tell when it was coming, when the flicker of doubt would return in her eyes, when she would grow quieter than usual. It was in these moments that he had to remind himself that healing wasn't a race. The scars of her past wouldn't simply vanish. They would take time to mend, and they would need patience. One evening, after a long shift, Daniel returned to the orphanage with his heart heavy. He had been dealing with some difficult cases in his work as a police officer, cases that had dragged him back into the darkness of his own grief. The weight of it all had been bearing down on him more than usual. His own pain, the loss of his daughter, felt fresh again, as though it had never truly left. But when he saw Maya, sitting on the steps of the orphanage, looking out into the evening sky, he felt the familiar pull in his chest. "Maya," he called, his voice gentle. She turned toward him, her expression unreadable. "Hey, Dan," she replied, the slight tremor in her voice betraying her attempt to seem unaffected. Daniel could see that something was wrong. Maya's eyes were darker than usual, a distant look clouding her gaze. He walked over and sat down next to her on the steps. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. "You seem quiet tonight." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared out at the setting sun, her arms wrapped around her knees. Daniel could feel the weight of her silence. "I don't know if I'm doing this right," Maya said after a long pause, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I'm doing life right." Daniel's heart tightened. He hadn't realized until that moment how much pressure Maya must have been feeling. It was clear now that despite her progress, there was a lingering fear that she was not enough, that she wasn't worthy of the love and care he had been offering her. "You don't have to do life perfectly, Maya," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "There's no right or wrong way to heal. All you have to do is take it one step at a time." She shook her head, her small body trembling slightly. "I'm scared, Dan. What if this is just a dream? What if one day I wake up and you're not here anymore? What if this family, isn't real?" Daniel's chest tightened as he heard the rawness in her voice. It was a fear he had never fully understood until now. He had been so focused on being there for her, on trying to be the father figure she needed, that he hadn't fully realized the depths of the uncertainty she was carrying. "I'm not going anywhere, Maya," he said, his voice unwavering. "I promise you, I'm not going anywhere. You are my family now. I'm here for you, no matter what. We're in this together." She looked at him then, her eyes filled with the kind of pain only someone who had been abandoned could understand. "But how can you be sure? How can you promise me that?" Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. He had never thought about it in those terms, never fully considered the depth of Maya's fear that people could leave her. His own pain and loss, his grief, had always been a part of his healing process, but in this moment he realized just how much of Maya's past was still hovering over her like a dark cloud. "I know it's hard to believe," Daniel said softly, "but I am sure. I made a promise to you, remember? A promise to be here for you, and I'm not breaking that promise, Maya. Not for anything. This family we're building, it's real. You and me. We're both figuring it out, but we're doing it together." For a long moment, Maya didn't respond. She just stared at him, as if searching for the sincerity in his words. And in that silence, Daniel held her gaze, letting her see the truth in his eyes. He had made mistakes in his past, and he had failed in ways he could never undo. But this moment with Maya was different. He wasn't going to fail her. Not again. Finally, Maya lowered her gaze, her shoulders sagging with the weight of her emotions. Slowly, she reached out and took his hand in hers, her tiny fingers curling around his like a lifeline. "I'm scared too," she admitted quietly. "I'm scared that I'll mess it all up, that I'll lose you, or that I'll never be good enough. But I'm trying, Dan. I really am." Daniel's heart swelled with a mix of pride and sorrow. He could see it now, the strength in her, buried beneath the layers of pain. Maya wasn't just surviving anymore. She was learning to live, to trust, to love again. "You're already more than good enough, Maya," Daniel said, his voice filled with affection. "You're amazing, and I'm so proud of you. I'm proud of how far you've come. I'm proud of you for being brave enough to feel all these things, and you don't have to do it alone anymore. I'm here, always." Maya looked up at him, her eyes softening. She didn't say anything more, but in that moment, Daniel could see the shift in her. Something inside her had softened. She wasn't ready to let go of all her fears, not yet. But for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. The road ahead was still uncertain, filled with challenges neither of them could foresee. But in that moment, Daniel knew something had changed. They had taken another step together, a step toward healing, toward trust, and toward the family they were becoming, piece by fragile piece. And as they sat together on the steps, watching the sun sink lower into the horizon, Daniel realized that this journey, this second chance, was one they would face side by side, no matter what came next. Together, the unseen struggles. As the days continued to unfold, both Daniel and Maya found themselves navigating through new terrains of emotion and experience. Their bond, now undeniable, was tested in ways neither of them could have predicted. The orphanage, once a place of refuge for Daniel, became the stage for many of their most difficult moments. While the laughter of the other children provided a soundtrack to their days, there were still quiet, shadowed corners where the weight of their personal histories pressed down heavily. Daniel was familiar with grief. He had lived with it for years, carried it through every shift, every sleepless night, each moment that passed in the absence of his daughter. He thought he had learned to cope with loss, to let it be a part of who he was without letting it consume him. But Maya's presence in his life stirred things in him he hadn't expected. He found himself haunted by memories of his daughter more often than he'd like to admit. It was as though Maya, with her quiet bravery, was calling him to remember the parts of himself he had buried under layers of hardened resilience. And yet, when he was with Maya, when she looked up at him with those wide, trusting eyes, Daniel realized that he couldn't afford to hold onto the past forever. She needed him to be present, to be a father, not a man defined solely by what he had lost. But this was harder than he anticipated. Maya, too, struggled, though in ways that were more hidden, more fragile. On the outside, she seemed to be adjusting well. She was smiling more, playing with the other children, and even helping Sister Margaret with small tasks around the orphanage. But behind the smiles, there were moments when she would retreat into herself, her eyes clouded with uncertainty. The memories of her mother and father, of the lives that had been ripped away from her, came to her unbidden. The trauma of abandonment, of never having a place to truly call home, lingered in the corners of her heart, even if she didn't speak of it. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult morning, Maya found herself alone in the corner of the playroom. The other children were outside, playing tag and laughing, but Maya wasn't in the mood for games. The events of the past few days had caught up with her, the memories, the pressure to adjust, the guilt she felt about her own emotions. It was too much. She sat on the floor, clutching a tattered doll close to her chest, her legs crossed beneath her. She didn't notice when Daniel walked into the room. He had just finished his patrol and had stopped by the orphanage to check in on her. He had seen the look in her eyes earlier that day, a look that spoke volumes more than words ever could. Maya. His voice was soft, like he was approaching a wild animal that might run away at any moment. Maya didn't look up, though she heard his footsteps approach. She just sat there, silent, her small fingers nervously tugging at the frayed edges of her doll's dress. "Hey, what's going on?" Daniel asked, crouching down in front of her. His tone was gentle, but there was an unmistakable edge of concern. He had seen this behavior before. She was withdrawing again, retreating to a place he couldn't reach. "I'm fine," Maya muttered, though the words were hollow, lacking the usual spark in her voice. "You don't look fine," Daniel said quietly. "You've been quiet all day. You know you can talk to me, right?" Maya squeezed her eyes shut, and for a moment, the room was filled only with the sound of her shallow breathing. She didn't want to admit it, didn't want to say the words that had been haunting her. "I don't want to mess things up," she said suddenly, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't want you to leave like they did. I don't want you to get tired of me." Daniel's heart tightened at the rawness of her admission. It was clear now that her fears had become deeper, more ingrained in her soul. She wasn't just worried about being abandoned. She was afraid that she wasn't enough, that she wasn't worthy of someone staying. "Maya," Daniel said softly, sitting beside her on the floor, his eyes searching hers. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going to leave you, ever." Maya shook her head, a faint tear slipping down her cheek. "How can you be sure? How can you be sure I'm not going to mess everything up? I don't know how to be good enough. I don't know how to be the daughter you want me to be." Daniel exhaled a shaky breath, running a hand through his hair as he struggled to find the right words. He hadn't fully understood the depth of Maya's fear until this moment. The simple truth was that she had no frame of reference for unconditional love, no understanding of the stability that could come from someone who truly cared. She had spent too many years in uncertainty, too many years of disappointment and loss. How could she possibly believe that someone, anyone, would stay when the people who were supposed to love her most had walked away? "I'm not asking you to be perfect," Daniel said, his voice steady. "I'm not asking you to be anything other than who you are. You are enough, Maya. You've always been enough. I'm not leaving you because you make mistakes or because things get hard. I'm staying because you are my family, and that's not going to change." She turned her head away, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the doll tighter. It seemed like she wasn't ready to let go of her fears, not yet. And maybe she wasn't supposed to. Healing took time, and Maya was still learning that it was okay to lean on someone when she needed help. She wasn't supposed to do everything alone. "I don't know how to believe you," Maya said, her voice barely audible. "I know it's hard to believe," Daniel acknowledged, his voice thick with emotion. "I get that, but I'm not asking you to trust me all at once. Just take it one day at a time, okay? One step at a time. And when you feel like you're not enough, or that things are too hard, I'll be here. Every time." Maya looked at him then, her eyes full of uncertainty. The wall she had built around her was still there, but Daniel could see cracks in it. Tiny fractures that could one day give way to something more. She reached for his hand, hesitantly at first, but then more confidently as she felt the warmth and security in his touch. "Will you always be here, Dan?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I will," Daniel said, his heart swelling with love for this little girl who had come to mean the world to him. "Always." And with those words, Maya finally allowed herself to relax a little, just a little, and leaned against him. She rested her head on his shoulder, and for the first time in days, the tears she had been holding back fell freely. They weren't tears of fear or of sadness. They were tears of release, a small, fragile beginning of letting go. Daniel held her close, wrapping his arm around her protectively, feeling the weight of her fears. He knew that there would be more struggles ahead, more moments of doubt and insecurity. But for the first time, he felt like he could see the glimmer of hope in Maya's eyes. Slowly, but surely, she was learning that there was someone who wasn't going to leave her. Someone who loved her not because she was perfect, but because she was enough. And that, Daniel knew, was the most important thing he could give her. Not just as an officer or as a protector, but as her father. A family forged in the fire. As the seasons changed, so too did the dynamic between Daniel and Maya. What had started as a tentative bond between a grieving man and an abandoned child slowly morphed into something far more profound. The emotional scars that had bound them both, Daniel's loss and Maya's abandonment, began to form an unspoken understanding between them. Yet even as the world around them continued to move forward, both of them knew they were not without their struggles. The past, no matter how distant it seemed, had a way of creeping back into their lives when they least expected it. For Daniel, the hardest part was seeing Maya wrestle with her fear of attachment. Though she had accepted that he was staying, that he wasn't going to leave her, there were still moments when her trust wavered. She would pull back, withdraw into herself, as if afraid that by loving him, she was setting herself up for more heartbreak. It wasn't that she didn't want to accept him. It was that the pieces of her heart that had been broken by betrayal and loss took time to piece back together. One chilly evening, when the stars twinkled like diamonds in the night sky, Maya sat quietly by the window in the small room she shared with the other children. Her journal lay open on her lap, but she wasn't writing. Instead, she was lost in thought, her eyes staring into the vast expanse outside, searching for something she couldn't quite name. There was a storm brewing inside her, one that Daniel could see even when she tried to hide it. He had grown accustomed to reading Maya's emotions. She didn't need to say a word for him to understand when something was bothering her. Tonight, she seemed especially distant, and Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He knocked gently on the door, then poked his head in. "Mind if I come in?" Maya didn't look up immediately, but she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Daniel entered and sat down on the edge of her bed, offering a warm smile. He had spent countless evenings like this, just sitting with her, trying to offer her comfort without pushing her too hard. He knew that healing wasn't something that could be rushed. "What's going on, Maya?" Daniel asked softly, his voice steady. Maya finally met his gaze, her dark eyes filled with a mix of uncertainty and sadness. "I'm trying, Dan. I really am. But I keep wondering if I'm doing it all wrong." Daniel's heart sank. He had seen this look before, a look of doubt so deep that it seemed to permeate every part of her. It was as if she was waiting for something to go wrong, anticipating the moment when the ground would crumble beneath her feet. "You're doing just fine," he said, his voice unwavering. "You don't have to be perfect. None of us are. I'm not asking you to be someone you're not, Maya. All I want is for you to be yourself." Maya swallowed hard, her eyes brimming with emotion. "But what if myself isn't good enough?" she asked, her voice trembling with vulnerability. "What if I can't be the daughter you deserve? What if I'm just a burden to you?" Daniel's heart clenched, and he moved closer, taking her hand in his. He could feel her shaking, the weight of her self-doubt pressing down on her like an invisible force. "Maya," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "you are not a burden. You've never been a burden to me. I chose to be here with you because I want to be. You are everything I never knew I needed. And you are more than good enough. You always have been." Maya's eyes welled with tears, and she quickly wiped them away, embarrassed. She wasn't used to having someone speak to her like this, someone who saw her for who she truly was and loved her without hesitation. It was a love she had never known before, one that felt foreign, yet incredibly safe. "I'm scared, Dan," she whispered. I'm scared of failing you, of making you regret taking me in. I don't know how to be what you want. I don't know if I can do this." Daniel gently cupped her face in his hands, his gaze soft and full of warmth. "There is no failure, Maya," he said, his voice calm but firm. "There's only us, working through things together. You don't have to do this alone anymore. We're a team, okay?" She nodded slowly, taking in his words. Though her doubts weren't gone, they seemed to ease just a little in that moment. The reassurance he offered her wasn't a magic fix. It wasn't going to solve everything at once. But for the first time, Maya allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. She wasn't alone in this fight. She had someone who truly cared about her, someone who had chosen her. The following days were a mixture of small victories and setbacks. Maya still had moments of quiet withdrawal, times when she needed space to process her emotions. But Daniel was there, never pushing, always patient, and more determined than ever to be the father she needed. His love for her had grown beyond measure, and though he had his own struggles, Maya's presence in his